Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Vancouver, British Columbia. Psychic tells all. Few venues are as public as a radio station phone-in show. In the late 1970s, when Vancouver on-air personality Terry Moore invited the very psychic Frida Fell to be a guest on his program, Lower Mainland listeners were treated to some fascinating otherworldly interviews. Fell had apparently been clairvoyant as long as she could remember. She recalled that as a child living in England, she thought that everyone could detect what other people were thinking, and that everyone received communications from the dead. She frequently held what she thought were normal conversations with dead relatives. Over time, she realized that her abilities were very special gifts, and she began to train herself to act as a communications conduit, both from the living to the dead and from the dead to the living. Her abilities were so strong, and she honed them so carefully, that by the time she immigrated from England to British Columbia, she was able to give amazingly accurate psychic readings, even over the phone. The first caller to Terry Moore's show was a woman. She had uttered only 3 words, "Good afternoon, Frida," when the medium began to intuit information about the caller. Fell saw, with her mind's eye, that the woman was wearing a blue ring. A voice in Fell's inner ear, as she described it, told her that the caller was close to an elderly woman who was beginning to suffer from memory lapses. The information was amazingly accurate, as absolutely confirmed by the caller, but disappointingly for me, did not involve any contact with the souls of the dead. Neither did any of the other on-air conversations that day. During an in-person session, however, Frida was able to help a young woman come to terms with her deceased grandmother, a person whom she held great resentment against. No sooner had the meeting began, Gail, a pseudonym, and Frida began. Then Frida announced to Gail that her paternal grandmother was present and very anxious to communicate with the younger woman. Gail had come to Frida for the information on other matters, and her reaction to Frida's announcement was swift and most assuredly not positive. Grandmother, it seemed, had made not only Gail's existence miserable, but also that of her mother. The death of her father's mother had actually meant a relief from suffering for the other 2 women. Because of the resentment at the treatment that she had received at the hand of her grandmother, Gail had no desire at all to interact with the deceased woman's spirit, and initially would not even entertain hearing from her grandmother. Finally, the psychic insisted, "If you don't want your grandmother to speak to you, there's no use going any further. I have no control over the spirit friends or loved ones who want to come through me, and I won't close the door to any of them. They each have the right to have their say. So if you're opposed to your grandmother for some family reason, we might as well terminate this session right now." Having heard the gifted woman's ultimatum, Gail changed her mind and agreed to listen to the message from the spirit of her once feared grandmother. Her agreement was a turning point in resolving issues that everyone in the family had thought insoluble. It seems that Gail's grandmother had, after her death, realized how cruel she had been to both her daughter-in-law and her grandmother. She came through to Gail via Frida to express her remorse and regret. As a result, hurts carried by both the living and the dead were at last cleared up. This story takes place in Kelowna, British Columbia. The Phantom Carriage. Kelowna's Gaizakchan Ranch has a long and romantic past. The house was built in the 1980s for Governor-General Lord Aberdeen. The property was named after Lady Aberdeen's childhood home in Scotland. Reports indicated that until a few years ago, it was the site of an unusual haunting. Every so often, the wheels of a phantom carriage rolling along the gravel driveway and the clip-clop of phantom horse hoofs could be heard approaching the house. Then the sounds would cease for a few moments, as though the buggy had stopped for the passengers to get out. Moments later, the sounds would start up again, this time retreating, and yet no one ever saw a carriage, and no guests arrived at the house. No one knows when the phantom carriage began arriving, but local legend has it that the original carriage was carrying guests to a party that Lord and Lady Aberdeen were hosting. Perhaps tragically struck the little group on the way, and their souls were doomed to repeat that final journey for decades and decades to come. Many people have witnessed the phenomenon, and nearly as many have investigated it, hoping to find an explanation for the mysterious sounds, or at the very least to see something. There have been no reports ever of an apparition being seen, but the auditory manifestation was heard over and over again through the years. Elaine Cameron, who enjoyed a lengthy residency on the property, suggested that the flat land surrounding the ranch would allow sound from a carriage on a nearby road to travel unobstructed towards the house until the vehicle was in such a position that the sound waves were blocked by the rows of trees along the driveway, just long enough to give the impression of a rig having stopped. The sounds would then pick up again once the carriage had moved far enough so that the trees no longer blocked them. That explanation is certainly an interesting one, and in the days of travel by horse and carriage, it might even have made sense. When the sounds of the phantom horse-drawn buggy were still being heard for years after the advent of the automobile, that explanation became as puzzling as the sounds themselves. These phantom presences were very much a part of the site for many years. However, according to George Reeder, who currently owns and operates the restaurant, the Geisa Chan House, the ghosts that haunted the place for so long may at last have gone on to their final reward. The Sasquatch. Starting at the beginning has always seemed to me to be a logical approach. Therefore, I naively began to scan archived newspapers for the first public acknowledgement of the creature that Canadians refer to as Sasquatch, and Americans know as Bigfoot. It was several weeks before I finally realized that what I sought would be found within a totally different medium. The first recognition of the beast's existence was not in the typeset words, but in carved images, renderings chiseled into the wooden totem poles of the First Nations people of northwestern North America. The large and elusive Sasquatch was not just a mysterious legend to these people. It was a dangerous reality. Its inclusion on totem poles was intended to both recognize the existence of the species and warn of the threat that it represented. When non-natives began exploring the New World, First Nations people advised from the frightening beasts in the woods. As explorer David Thompson's expedition made its way across the Rocky Mountains into what is now British Columbia, natives that Thompson encountered told him about a huge, hairy creature and warned him of its dangers. Thompson recorded those cautions in his journal on January 5, 1811. On January 7, his diary entry records his party as having found the enormous footprints of a biped frozen into the terrain along their exploration route. This discovery immediately changed Thompson's somewhat amused skepticism to fearful respect for the creature that had created those humbling prints. A First Nations group living along the west coast recalled times when some of their people had returned from fishing and hunting trips with terrifying stories about giants standing on the banks of rivers, bombarding them with huge stones, and about being chased through the woods by the Sasquatch. Even American President Theodore Roosevelt acknowledged the beast's existence in his book Wilderness Hunter. He included a long narrative about the experiences of two hunters who, after finding huge tracks, tried to stalk the animal, but found that it was stalking them instead. The contest of hunting skills ended with one of the hunters fled after finding his partner's body. The deceased's neck had been snapped and his throat sliced open. The survivor described the lethal wounds as looking like they had been caused by 4 huge claws. One of the most amazing encounters with this creature occurred in southwestern British Columbia at the beginning of July in 1884. The crew on a train traveling between Lytton and Yale, alongside the Thompson River, spotted a strange creature not far from the tracks. As the engineer applied the brakes, several men on board jumped from the train and pursued, and actually caught the gorilla-like beast. They caged the hairy oddity, which they named Jacko. It was determined by his height, 140 centimeters, 4 feet, 7 inches, and weighed 57.6 kilograms, or 127 pounds. The Jacko was a youngster. No one knows what eventually happened to this diminutive Sasquatch. There had been talk of transporting him to England for exhibition, and it's commonly accepted that the captured animal succumbed to the combined torments of incarceration and transportation. The story, however, remains a classic in Sasquatch lore. Although sightings continued throughout the province, no further specimens were ever captured. In 1924, however, quite the reverse is said to have occurred. Alfred Otzman, who was searching for a lost gold mine in the Toba Inlet area of British Columbia's coast mountains, was plucked from his campsite as he lay sleeping. The would-be miner reported that he was carried by a Sasquatch to what seemed to be the beast's home. There were other such creatures at that encampment with whom Osman took to be his captor's immediate relatives. Although he was not restrained in any way, the man stayed with the extraordinary family for 6 days. He reported that they were vegetarians and that their communication system was based on a series of sounds and signals. In 1901, a Sasquatch sighting near Campbell River on Vancouver Island was reported by several newspapers, including the Victoria columnist Mike King. A man described in the reports as a fine type of man with an enviable reputation for reliability had been scouting for timber stands to be logged. As he made his way throughout the island's forested areas, guides who had been accompanying him suddenly refused to travel any further. They explained that the search was venturing dangerously close to the lands where the dreaded monkey men were thought to dwell. With a confidence born of naivety, King made his way through the forest on his own until he came to a clearing surrounding a pool of water. What he saw at the edge of that pond must have been instantly deflated. King's ill-conceived cockiness. A large and powerful creature was crouched there, albeit placidly rinsing plant roots. King later described it as a beast-man. He referred the following description of the animal's appearance. It is remarkably similar to other reports of the Sasquatch. Covered with reddish-brown hair, and his arms were peculiarly long and were used freely in climbing and in brush running, whereas the trail showed a distinct human foot, but was phenomenally long and spreading toes. Slowly, it seemed, European explorers and settlers were learning that the tales of the huge, hairy, human-like monster were not merely First Nations legends, but factual reports, Warnings to the wise. No longer did the newcomers wonder why so many sites around British Columbia's north coastal town of Bella Coola carried names that included a word that the Europeans translated as ape. For example, Ape Lake, Ape Creek, Ape Glacier, and Ape Mountain. What had been initially thought to be the imaginings of the First Nations culture were now being accepted as true accounts of dangerous creatures. Even as this realization was taking hold, occasional encounters of the Sasquatch continued. During the summer of 1906, a prospector told the newspaper Yukon World that he had recently seen a wild man on the shores of Horn Lake, northeast of Port Alberni. The man, who requested anonymity because he was not looking for notoriety, described the beast as being covered with a growth of hair much like bears, and added that it ran with astonishing agility, and as soon as he saw us, he concluded his reports by asserting that wild man is no figment of the imagination. You can take my word for that. In 1907, newspapers carried an article about a landowner near Vernon who found a giant footprint on one side of a 2-meter, 6-foot wide creek running through his property. There was an opposing print on the opposite bank. According to a report in Calgary Herald, the impression was 48 centimeters, 19 inches in length, with the big toe alone measuring 16 centimeters, 5 inches. People in the region flocked to see the strange prints. It was judged at the time that the creatures whose foot left the mark would have been at least 4 meters, 13 feet tall. In October 1941, the Edmonton Bulletin newspaper carried banner headlines reading, "Beast stands 10 feet high, paws 16 inches long, trackers state." The incident being reported occurred roughly 170 kilometers, 105 miles east of the city of Vancouver. Reporter Alex Jean-Testis wrote, Mr. George Chapman of Ruby Creek reported that a hairy giant, 10 feet, 3 meters tall, and having the shape of a man covered with shaggy brown hair, had chased her and her 4 children from their home in the woods. Other reports indicate that Miss Chapman had only 2 children, a boy Jimmy and a girl Rosie. As this sighting of the strange creature was the 3rd in 2 years, it caused quite a stir among Miss Chapman's neighbors. This latest encounter began when she heard her children, who had been playing in the backyard, suddenly scream. I looked out to see what had frightened the children and saw a huge hairy man, about 10 feet, 3 meters tall, coming from the direction of the barn. We fled to the woods and stayed there in the pouring rain for over 3 hours before we dared go back to the house, Miss Chapman explained. Though the wet weather may not have been comfortable for the Chapmans hiding in the forest, it did serve to make the ground soft and therefore easily imprinted by the giant's feet. According to the article, Miss Chapman said the tracks left by the monster were 16 inches, 41 centimeters long, 5 inches, 13 centimeters across the heel, and 8 inches, 20 centimeters at the broad part of the foot. The sighting caused some controversy between the 2 cultures in the immediate area. Those of European descent felt that the frightened family had misidentified a giant bear, whereas the natives concurred that their heritage had long spoken of a strange tribe of Sasquatch that inhabit the country and come out of their cave homes periodically to roam over a wide area, never stopping long at any one place. With perhaps an air of smugness, or possibly optimism, the journalist writing about Ruby Creek encounter concluded by stating police and white settlers, however, have never taken the stories very seriously. The Chapmans abandoned their cabin and moved on. That initiative was perhaps just as well, because in May 1956, there was another sighting in the area. Stan Hunt, an auctioneer from Vernon, spotted two giant creatures on the opposite side of Ruby Creek. In 1947, sighting was not able for 3 reasons. First, there were a pair of the animals, rather than just one. Second, they were quite close to civilization. Finally, the bodies of those 2 specimens were not covered just in their own hair. This unusual Sasquatch observation was made by Nellie Werner and her husband while traveling up an old logging road on Grouse Mountain, only minutes from downtown Vancouver. The creatures that the Werners saw were as large as those in other reports, but they wore rudimentary clothing. Their bodies were wrapped in cloaks of skins. Interestingly, as Miss Werner had at that time never heard of such a thing as Sasquatch, she simply presumed that they happened upon some sort of wild man. In 1957, a gentleman named William Monroe swore of an affidavit attesting to an encounter that he had some 2 years earlier. He had been working with a highway crew near the east central British Columbia town of Dragonsjewel, just west of Jasper, Alberta. During some time off, he decided to explore the surroundings. While exploring, he saw off in the distance what he at first thought was a bear. As soon as the animal moved, Rowe knew that he'd been wrong. That animal was no bear. The creature was just 2 meters, 6 feet in height, and 1 meter, 3.3 feet in breadth. It was covered from head to toe with silver-tipped dark brown hair. Rowe decided to hide from the strange creature, and his tactic was effective. Because he continued to have a clear view as it harvested and ate branches, he reported that he was close enough to accurately determine this was a female of the species. He was also able to make out facial features which, like other people, had encountered a Sasquatch as described as flat. Eventually the Sasquatch detected Rowe in the bushes and began to back away in fear. The man reported that he had a rifle with him. It had at first crossed his mind to shoot the animal and turn it over to scientists to examine. However, after having made eye contact with it, Rowe said that he could not bring himself to murder the thing. In November 1962, Joe Gregg, a bus driver for Pacific Stage Lines, was returning from a late run to Canadian Forces Base Chilliwack when he spotted what he initially thought was a very large man wearing a fur coat, standing on the side of the highway. Gregg slowed his vehicle and watched in amazement as the creature crossed the road in front of the bus. There was no question in the man's mind that he was observing a Sasquatch. He had enormous arms, enormous feet. He was at least 7 feet, 2.1 meters tall, and very agile. Gregg was so distressed by what he'd witnessed that night that for 5 years he told no one, except his wife, about what he'd seen. On June 28, 1965, 2 brothers were prospecting northeast of Vancouver in the Pitt Lake area. They came across tremendous footprints running through a valley and across a small frozen stream. The weight of whatever had left the prints had cracked the ice, and the prints picked up again on the opposite bank of the stream. The 2 were fascinated by their discovery and studied the imprints for some time. They estimated the length of a single print to be 60 centimeters, 24 inches, and the width to be half that measurement. The brothers followed the animal's trail until they came within sight of the creature. They knew instantly from other descriptions that they'd heard and read that they were gazing upon a Sasquatch. They stopped and for some time watched the animal as it stood in one place, rocking back and forth. They had plenty of time to observe its features, which they later described as flat. Although the brothers would never allow themselves to be identified, they did agree to accompany a journalist with the Vancouver Sun in a helicopter as the reporter photographed the gargantuan footprints. Even the decidedly non-sensualists, Globe and Mail carried the Sasquatch-related report from Caslow, a town on Kootenay Lake in the south of the province, during December 1978. 80-year-old Roy Green, a former mayor and councillor, had made a plaster cast of 43 centimeters, 17-inch footprints that residents believe had been made by a Sasquatch. He estimated that an animal with a footprint that large would have a stride 1.4 to 1.5 meters, 4.5 to 5 feet in length, and weigh 270 to 300 kilograms, or 600 to 800 pounds. Rex Alexander, a young man from the area, had found the prints while out hunting. Because of the secluded location in which he discovered the tracks, Alexander was convinced that they couldn't have been put there as a hoax. They were way off in the bush. It was just a fluke that I came across them. Newspapers all over Western Canada reported on a Sasquatch sitting by Tim Messier in April 1979. The sighting took place along the southern shore of Dune Lake, just east of where Highway 24 joins Highway 1 north of Kamloops. Tim, who was 16 at the time, immediately told his father Ken about spying a huge figure standing upright along the lake shore. It had been about 100 meters, 300 feet from where he was. The young man explained he had heard the creature utter a high-pitched scream before it fled in an upright position up a steep ravine. When father and son returned to the spot later in the day, they found that the teepee-like structure had been constructed to cover a freshly killed deer. Further investigation revealed that the footprints of the animal that Tim had seen were shaped like a human's, but much larger. Roughly 40 centimeters, 16 inches long. The distance between prints indicated that the creature had a stride nearly 2 meters, 6 feet long. Though father and son were pleased with their unusual experience, the man who owned the land was not. Wayne LaHook complained that after the Sasquatch sighting, his farm property was overrun with adventurers, hoping for a glimpse at the unusual creature. On November 11th, 1989, many kilometers away from Dune Lake, in the coastal town of Bella Coola, there was another sighting. This one also involved a 16-year-old youth, Jimmy Nelson, who was sitting with his mother and his friend Glenn Clelman at the family's kitchen table. First Stone and then another of the trio detected a terrible odor. An odor that hadn't been present just moments before. Curious Glenn looked out the kitchen window and saw what he at first thought was a bear. He called the others to the window, and together they watched as the bad-smelling animal, which was definitely not a bear, fled on 2 feet into the woods. They all agreed that the creature that they'd seen was almost 3 meters, 10 feet in height, had enormous shoulders, and ran as a human being would. With the courage of youth, the two boys pursued the strange creature. They were less than 10 meters, 30 feet from it when it turned, glared at them, and growled. The boys may have been young and brave, but they were not foolish. They turned tail and ran back to the Nelsons' cabin. The next day they headed out again to investigate further. This time there was no sign of the animal itself, just the tracks and its feet had made as it fled. The foregoing accounts describe some of the Sasquatch sightings that have taken place over the years in British Columbia. Many additional encounters have been reported, and no doubt very many more than that have not been reported. This story takes place between Hope and Princeton, British Columbia. Mournful sounds still heard. Kevin McDermott arrived in British Columbia in the late 1860s, temporarily leaving his wife at home in Scotland. He worked in the mines between Hope and Princeton, desperately trying to amass sufficient funds to get settled and send for his beloved. In 1869, with McDermott still well short on his financial goal, there was a terrible explosion at the mine where he worked. Although he survived the blast, one of his legs was blown off. He would never work as a miner again. Not knowing what else to do, he wrote to his wife. Not only did he need her to nurse him back to health, but also to help him cope. Miss McDermott arrived in the extraordinarily beautiful southwestern British Columbia countryside, and as best they were able, the couple made a home for themselves. The spot that they had chose was very isolated. They lived there for many years. One of Kevin McDermott's greatest pleasures was to make his way up into the hills carrying his bagpipes. There he would play mournful melodies to the wide open spaces, rugged peaks, and deep valleys. When Miss Dermott took ill one year, Kevin tried frantically to save her. Despite his determined efforts, the woman died. Kevin grieved terribly and became quite reclusive. The years passed by. When nearby town folks, who were used to seeing the eccentric Scotsman at least a few times a year, noticed that he hadn't made his usual trek into town for supplies, they became concerned and organized a party to check on Kevin, who was by this time an old man. As the group approached the small ramshackle abode, they knew all was not well, for the lifeless body of the man's horse lay on the ground, still tethered to a tree near the house. Further into the woods, they found the remains of McDermott's bagpipes. They searched throughout the area, but never found the man, his corpse, or any clue as to what might have happened. Locals say that on a clear night you can still hear the melancholy strains of a lover's lament played on bagpipes. Some people even claim that they have seen the phantom lone piper as he chanted an ode to his long-deceased beloved. This story takes place in Field, British Columbia. Phantoms in Field. In Yoho National Park, about half-hour's drive west of the famous Rocky Mountain attraction of Lake Louise, is the town of Field, British Columbia. Field is no ghost town. Far from it. Field is a bustling community full of vibrant, active individuals, but it is also full of ghosts. Cemeteries are not as often haunted as people think that they might be, but the graveyard in Field is alive with ghosts. Most visitors to the enclosure can feel the spirit's presence. On one occasion, a young First Nations man was physically unable to enter the area. He reported feeling a wall of energy holding him back. In another incident, an employee with Parks Canada reported that the first time he had to go into the cemetery to obtain water samples, he felt extremely uncomfortable, as though he was being closely watched, almost scrutinized. Nevertheless, he attended to the matter that he had to, and then left as quickly as possible. It wasn't until he was a good distance away from the graves that the hairs on his back of his neck finally lay back down. Although he didn't see anything in the way of either an apparition or ghost lights, He since decided that whatever spirits were residing in the place were somehow testing him, as the man has never felt the same foreboding in the place since that incident. He presumes that the entities found him acceptable. And then there's the ghost of the cowboy that is frequently seen in various places in field. Sometimes the manifestation is alone, and at other times it is with 2 other ghosts. A Reiki master who is sensitive to these sort of things indicates that it is field's location on some sort of energy vortex that has given rise to all the supernatural activity in town. At a possibly much more mundane level, field is nestled in a valley and surrounded closely by high mountains, which results in the town experiencing some of the most severe weather conditions in Canada. And perhaps these weather conditions build such a strong desire to survive that the spirits of the deceased don't want to give up and move on, even long after their bodies have died.